Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session of CME Palooza Fall. This is our lunchtime session. I'm Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza Fall, and I'd like to welcome you to this session entitled From Activation to Evolution: What CME Can Learn from the Trump Campaign, Uber Scandal, and Amazon. And this is our lunchtime gold sponsored session, sponsored by Genentech. I have to admit, when I first got when they first sent me the potential title of this session, I thought they were kidding. But I think that this is a really creative session and really creative content and something a little different. And I hope that everyone will kind of take a lot away from this session. So I'm joined today on this session. Our presenters are Mihan Zakaria, otherwise known today as Mihan Kelly, as you will see shortly. And she is joined by Shashi Shankar, and Shashi is playing the role of Shashi Cooper. So before we get started, I wanted to thank the sponsors of CME Palooza Fall, our gold sponsors, Genentech and Prova Education, our silver sponsors, ASIM, Forefront Collaborative, Global Academy for Medical Education, Integrity CE, Practicing Clinicians Exchange, our bronze sponsors, ACHL, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Global Education Group, Helio.com Education Lab, Highmark CE, Infograph Ed, Connective, Primary Care Network, RMEI, and Thistle Editorial. There are 3 ways to ask questions for this and all the CME Palooza Fall sessions for folks who are watching this live. There is a Google Slide link at the top of the live page. So if you just click on the Ask Questions for Scott Sessions, you should be able to ask questions through that link. You can use the CME Palooza text line to send in a question. The number is 267-6660-CME. That's 0263. Or you can tweet your questions to us using the hashtag CME Palooza. And people have been taking advantage of all 3 methods this morning, and hopefully we will get a lot of questions during this session here. So, briefly, speaker disclosure, just please keep in mind that the opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are those of our speakers and do not represent an endorsement or position of their employer, its parent company, or its affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Shashi Cooper to begin our discussion.
Hi, everyone. Actually,
no, Mihan's going first.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mihan Kelly.
And I'm Shashi Cooper.
Today, we're going to have a different type of discussion with you. We're going to review a few of the top stories from the past year to illustrate the impact of activation in case studies where organizations identified a problem or a gap by using simple data and further use that data to develop a strategy that fit their particular system. The twist is that these organizations are outside of the CME industry, but we promise that we will be connecting these provocative stories back to healthcare and a few principles we think are imperative in CME. Shashi Cooper, my co-host today, and I will explain
what the Trump campaign, Uber, and Amazon all have in common. These are 3 different worlds with 3 very different players and totally different dynamics, but they offer 3 different perspectives on a very important story. The Trump campaign will remind us to pay attention to accurate data versus fake data, as sometimes our own data can even surprise us. And it also presents an opportunity to build a strategy of true learning. The Uber scandal will remind us that continuous collective learning can lead to real change if it is built into the culture of an organization. And Amazon will amaze us by its ability to risk failure and allow learning to lead innovation.
They say the first step to recovery or towards a solution is first recognizing that there's a problem in the first place. But sometimes when we're faced with conflicting data, it's hard to pinpoint what that problem truly entails. For our first story, we focus on utilizing data to trigger awareness and activation. With that, Shashi, will walk us through the path towards an outcome that continues to shock the world, the Trump campaign.
Thank you so much, Mihan. Let's kick things off here with the story of the Trump campaign, the true story of the 2017 election, and how analytics revealed an obvious game plan that few believed would work. We progress to the next slide here. The story of the Trump campaign actually begins in 2012 when Barack Obama wins re-election by a landslide. If you remember around this time, re-election was not necessarily a promised thing for Barack Obama. It was actually a fairly contentious and tight election. What ended up happening on election night, though, led not only the national election to lean Democrat, but also to turn the GOP back to the Democrats for the Senate. We can go on to the next slide here. After the election, the GOP put together what they call the post-mortem report, or essentially a growth and opportunity project was its official title. And there were three authors here. And if we look at the bottom left, we should recognize the first guy. His name is Reince Priebus, who at the time was the chairman of the RNC. The report essentially examined why the Republicans lost national office and what they could do to sort of turn the tide going forward. And the theory of erroneous activation essentially lays this out. It basically said that the Republican Party needed to stop talking to itself because they had become an expert in this ideological reinforcement to like-minded people. In layman's terms, they had essentially created and reinforced an echo chamber. They pointed at the difference between the federal wing, where they believed this echo chamber was really potent, to the gubernatorial wing, where they had had some success over the past few years. And they believed that they had to mirror the approach taken by states within governor elections to really change the tide. And this is where I want to pause for a moment and point out this theory of erroneous activation, where sometimes data that make the most sense to us and seem most comfortable and align with our own expectations can seem to be the most obvious path forward. What this is saying with the Growth and Opportunity Project is that what the election had done was reveal that the path that had been taken at that point by Republicans had been wrong, and that they needed to sort of shift the tide completely in order to find success going forward. We can switch to the next slide. At the same time that this report came out, which was really built into the mainstream and read by most folks, a second report came out that was read and discussed by very few people. It was written by a man named Sean Trend, who worked at Real Clear Politics. And what Sean Trend wrote in 2012 was a theory called the case of the missing white voter. What he says is it's not the Republican Party that must change the focus and change the campaign pillars, but rather it's important for the Republicans to understand why certain voters did not show up, who historically have supported Republicans, and what they must do to, in his words, reactivate them in 2016. If we look at this table, there's a 6.7 million drop-off between 2008 and 2012, which Sean believed could be reactivated to be fully engaged and turn the tide for Republicans. The question was, what were the campaign topics and what were the focus areas going to be that would actually energize these white voters that had not actually showed up? So again, this is important to pause here and talk about the fact that there were two alternate theories. One was the one that was brought into the mainstream and made a lot of sense according to conventional political wisdom. The second was somewhat controversial in that what Sean writes is, no, actually, we need to double down and become more explicitly focused on certain campaign topics in order to win re-election. We can go to the next slide. So let's talk about activation here for a second. Just to sum this up, Reince Priebus and his fellow authors at the GOP wrote a report that basically said, let's focus on inclusivity, let's focus on outreach to minorities, let's not be the party of the rich guys, and let's lean more to the center. Sean writes, it's going to be important to focus on the missing white voter, drill down into the rural and working class demographics, and also talk at length about the economy. We can move to the next slide. Around the same time, Steve Bannon, who's in the center part of this slide, had read this report, and he met with two folks that he believed were going to sympathize with him and sort of agree with him as well. The first is on the bottom left, Jeff Sessions, now the Attorney General. And to the right, we have Stephen Miller, one of Jeff Sessions' aides at the time. And of course, they had read Sean Trend's 2012 report. At the same time, in 2016, Kellyanne Conway, who became a central part of the Trump election, wrote a report from her company called The Polling Company, where she essentially mirrored Sean's analysis and said that jobs actually were the most important topic, not immigration. She essentially stressed that if you could reach out to rural communities and those hit hard by the economic times and talk about how to bring the economy back up, immigration would be less intense of a topic. And if you remember around 2014 to 15, immigration was sort of up front and center in the election for a lot of campaign officials with Congress and with the Senate as well. And of course, all of these folks ended up becoming integral to President-elect Trump's election. We can move on to the next slide. So here we talk about advance. So now that they essentially had two theories and the Trump campaign decided to focus on Sean Trend's report, what did they actually do to reach actionable solutions and practical actions? Well, let's take a look at the sort of pillars of their campaign messages. There was economic populism, a focus on small town, rural, and working class folks, leveraging social media, building echo chambers where they could really provide reinforcement for their beliefs, talking about the issues that the coastal elites had, and also this motto of taking the country back. That last one's really important when we think about the fact that nearly 6.7 million white voters did not show up. So the Trump campaign was really built around this report from Tron Trend in terms of how to reactivate those folks and bring them back into the fold. We can go on to the next slide. Once they had found the right solutions and practical applications, the question became, how do we actually demonstrate engagement and practice those solutions that we've developed? Steve Bannon, who was with Breitbart News at the time, was also working with Rebecca Mercer, who's on the bottom left. She's been in the news recently for being sort of a top bundler and funder for covert GOP efforts. Together, they both contributed to a company called Cambridge Analytica. It was funded and formed by Rebecca and her family, and it was really operated by folks like Bannon, who sat on the board of directors. And what Cambridge Analytica did was they essentially focused on Facebook and Twitter and used automated messages to build those echo chambers. And if we go to the next slide, what we'll see here is that there was a huge difference, a 2.5-fold difference between the level of free media that Donald Trump received and that Hillary Clinton did. It doesn't mean that Donald Trump outspent Hillary Clinton. It actually means the exact opposite. He vastly underspent Hillary Clinton and still received 2.5 times as much free advertisement from media. And this is when we talk about the allocate stage instead of in terms of substantiating partnerships and extending the solution beyond just merely practicing it. We'll go to the next slide here. In addition to that, when we talk about extending the solution, let's look at the visits that Donald Trump during the election made to more critical states. We have Florida, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Michigan. And these were really part of the core states that turned the tide for the national election and created this huge upset. If we focus specifically on Wisconsin, a state that has typically kind of swayed back and forth, but it was surprising that it went fully red this year. If we look at Donald Trump's 6 visits to Hillary Clinton zeros, it's quite telling in terms of what their strategy was and what the voting demographics are of these states and whom they were trying to reach out to and what their messaging really was. That's why they were really focusing, if you look at the blue text, on the missing voters. We'll go to the next slide here. Let's revisit Cambridge Analytica. So we talked about the fact that they were creating echo chambers on Facebook and Twitter and other social media. What's really fascinating here is that by election day, fake news stories that had been pumped out by organizations like Cambridge Analytica actually eclipsed the mainstream news that was being distributed. This simply means that there was almost a 0.7 million increase in the stories that were generated versus the stories that were actually fed out by mainstream media. And if we think about the sort of influx of information to the right voting demographics, fake news here actually really helped change the tide when we look at how many folks they're reaching each day. We can go to the next slide. So in sum, before we look at the end of this slide presentation, at the time of the election, I can certainly say for myself and of course for Mihan as well, we're looking at the data coming in and most estimations had Hillary Clinton winning by a landslide. It wasn't even supposed to be close. We're looking at this presentation from the Upshot, the New York Times at 93% for Hillary Clinton and then 88% for Real Clear Politics. Just looking at the spread of the map, it looks fairly certain that Hillary Clinton is going to win. And this is really built on the fact that most folks in the mainstream, whether they were Democrat, Independent, or Republican, had really bought into, in some form or another, the report from the GOP in 2012 that said that the Republicans had to drastically change their messaging. And because Donald Trump had refused to change his messaging, the wisdom essentially dictated that they were not going to win the election because they were sort of forsaking what they had to do to reach voters that they needed to reach. We can go to the next slide. But what we see here is really remarkable, just to pause and digest these graphics for a moment. A majority of voters that were white college graduates voted for Donald Trump. A large percentage of white voters with no college degree voted for Donald Trump. And it's actually surprising when we look at the bottom two as well, non-white voters with college degrees and non-white voters without college degrees. And what this really demonstrates is that the discarded path, which few folks believed, and in fact, Donald Trump was the only Republican candidate out of a field of 17 to really dedicate his time to that approach, this path ended up being the right path in the end.
Wow, that is a great example of how sometimes even our own data can be surprising. But it also presents a great opportunity for learning. It's interesting to reflect on the notion of accurate data versus convenient data and how they can really shape different strategies.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think what it says is that there's real value in paying attention to what the data are telling you, even when, and maybe especially if it's uncomfortable or provocative. If we translate this to the CME space, we've heard from learners in academic and top institution, these are often experts in their field, that they're usually baffled or confused when they see lower than expected metrics or outcomes on their own health system's performance, or when there's not 100% adoption, per se, of a standard of care. So whether there's a national benchmark or another benchmark, systems may find that their own performance varies in comparison, and they usually have to dig deep to find out what's actually happening here.
I've heard and seen that as well, Shashi. And furthermore, I think it's important, as you've shown, to integrate the customer's voice through the appropriate use of data. Here, the customers were the voters and they wanted their concerns to be heard and addressed. In our world, we have to listen to those learners, to the local needs and challenges that clinicians in health systems and communities face, and build a better plan for education that will advance solutions forward so that learners can aspire to really integrate those solutions into clinical practice.
I agree, and often it isn't the convenient narrative or the comfortable data that are going to be right. And I think that's why it's important for us in the CME community to look at all angles, all perspectives, consider all appropriate sets of data, because it's critical to break the echo chambers of our own biases and eliminate the opportunity for theory-laden data by objectively evaluating metrics from every angle. In healthcare and in CME, learners are often confronted with conflicting sets of data, and the onus really is on each one of us to understand what's important, what's noise, and what to do with what we actually learn from the data, however uncomfortable it might be from time to time.
I see. So while even our own data can surprise us at times, awareness presents a great opportunity for activation, and then continuous collective learning can lead to real measurable change. And if you build a culture that uses learning less as a requirement and more as a culture, we can see great results.
Absolutely.
Speaking of culture, this brings us to our next example, the culture of Uber and how that is changing. Josh, please take us through that story.
Of course.
So Shashi, before you guys move on to that story, a few questions that have come in, a few comments that have come in more than anything else. So
Okay.
first of all, I'd like you to know that Shashi Cooper 360 is trending on Twitter right now.
It's funny.
We have a question of where you get your hair done, and then we have
At the NBC Today studio. I go to Mihan's morning show at 9 a.m. and get my hair done before I go. So.
And then we also have the question of who is the Donald Trump of CME. I don't know if you guys want to touch that one though.
Ooh, that's a pretty tough question. Yeah, I have some ideas, but yeah. we'll let that slide for now. We'll couch it and come back to it later on.
Okay, well I'll let you move on to your to the second case here.
Awesome, great. So Uber, a company that almost every one of us on this call and across the country, ostensibly across most nations in the world, are at least familiar with, perhaps haven't used, but definitely are aware of and familiar with. Let's take a look at Uber. After years of attacking challenges head on, a strategy perhaps of pride as opposed to genuine reflection and introspection, there arrived a watershed moment, an inflection point, if you will, that essentially unraveled Uber senior leadership and corporate culture overall. Every organization, every health system will inevitably confront uncomfortable, inconvenient data and truths. These issues, perhaps initially appearing small or minor, may potentially snowball into larger, impossible to ignore issues that require, uncomfortably and unfortunately sometimes, an entire system reset. So let's start here with the level set, Uber's indomitable image. Uber, it's no secret, has confronted a lot of lawsuits over its years. These are lawsuits from drivers, lawsuits from passengers, from their workforce, actual Uber employees, and perhaps most notably and most publicly known before everything happened over the past year, a lot of regulation pushback from government. For example, they were pushed out of the city of Austin, and Texas actually pushed back against Uber. They face similar challenges in London, where their license was actually recently revoked. So this is an ongoing issue. And yet, there's been massive success at Uber. There's been 126% growth since it formed until the last year of booking information. So if we pause for a moment, let's think about this in terms of a healthcare system. They may be facing issues from time to time, whether it's outcomes or patient safety. But if they continue to do extremely well, whether that's ratings or whether that's CMS reporting data, is that laudable or is that dangerous for the system? We're going to unpack that a little bit going forward. So let's switch to the next slide here. So against this backdrop, tons of regulation, tons of lawsuits going on, yet Uber continues to soar. a huge watershed moment on February 19th, 2017. A former engineer, Susan Fowler, puts a blog post up that alleges a history of sexual harassment in Uber and absolute zero action taken on the part of HR and her managers. If we look at this timeline, a lot of things happen. There's an independent investigation that's launched. Waymo sues Uber for poaching one of their engineers and essentially replicating their artificial intelligence technology for a self-driving car. Travis Kalanick is captured on an embarrassing dashcam video berating an Uber driver. There's the Grayball report, where Uber would secretly track government officials and either modulate or cancel rides to them in certain cities and states so as not to draw the ire of these regulators. And then, of course, Travis Kalanick announces a COO search in March of 2017. On the bottom half of this slide, this is really remarkable. A lot of times companies use their net positives and net negatives to understand their public perception, especially when they're a consumer-facing industry. And what is more consumer-facing than healthcare? Look at how the positive and the net negative completely flip after the negative stories come out. The positive press takes a huge hit, down to 43% net positive. And at the same time, if we look at the very bottom here, the negative news soars to 54%. And there's a huge contingent of folks that actually leave Uber. If we remember, there was a campaign on Twitter that was delete Uber. So it was hashtag delete Uber, and we saw that get a lot of traction. So here's some activation, a lot of stuff going on, but there's a blog post that really starts to upend the fabric of Uber. We can go to the next slide here. Now we talk about the solutions. What were some of the practical actions that Uber could take now that this blog post had come to the fore and a lot of other things were becoming made public? So Uber did two things. First, they started a commission that investigated the blog allegations specifically. And this company was Perkins Coie, who's really well known in the Bay Area, specifically in Silicon Valley. They work with a lot of tech companies to understand corporate culture, but also to investigate allegations of harassment or abuse within the cultural ranks. Number two, there was a report at the same time from Covington and Burling. This is actually read by the former Attorney General of the US, Eric Holder, and this looked more broadly at Uber's culture. So this is an indication fairly upfront that one, we're taking the allegations from Susan Fowler's blog post seriously, but number two, we're also looking broadly at Uber to kind of think about what we can do as an organization to reset our culture to make it more comfortable and more efficient and more productive. We can go to the next slide. So now we talk about what they did to actually demonstrate engagement. What were some of the solutions that they practiced after having these reports done? One, there was a leadership transition. That's actually an understatement. There was a sea change among what we call the A-team at Uber. The A-team was a group of folks that Travis had put together in the early days of the company. And a lot of these folks departed. And the New York Times has a fantastic graphic that looks at everybody that joined Uber originally and how they ended up leaving the company over the past year. Of course, Travis Kalanick also stepped down from the CEO post. They have a new CEO. And there was also a search launched for a new COO, which had never been a position started at Uber. Number two, there was an entire company culture revamp. So there was a new head of HR who committed to really changing the way HR functioned and practiced. Uber also put in strict policies surrounding culture for the first time. And diversity and inclusion are now executive goals. And this might seem like a fairly normal approach within a lot of Bay Area companies and companies across the country. But diversity and inclusion was never an executive goal at Uber. And this, I think, shows a true effort to want to move towards what they believe is the right approach. The third bucket here is accountability. Senior leaders are now actually held responsible for the actions of their subordinates and for the actions of their teams. Most importantly, perhaps, this invulnerable image of Uber as this Teflon Don who's not going to be impacted by lawsuits or by negative press, that's also disappeared. And amid increased public scrutiny, there are greater expectations for Uber. The expectation in the past was they didn't need to really respond to regulations, or they didn't need to really respond to lawsuits brought because they were Uber and they were going to be successful regardless of what. But now that they've been shown to actually have chinks in the armor and actually have flaws, there's a lot more public scrutiny and expectation that Uber will step up and take on the challenge. Now we talk about extending the solution. So where are we now, and what have they actually done now that they've created a roadmap to go ahead? I mentioned earlier that the CEO has been replaced by Dara, who used to lead Expedia. The first thing that Dara did was he really came in to essentially have a listening tour of Uber and also upfront look at what they could do to reset the company culture and become more effective going forward. When he came onto the CEO position, Uber had just been kicked out of London, which is a huge loss in terms of revenue. So if we think about what Uber's response would have been maybe a year or 2 years ago, it's fair to say that Travis Kalanick probably would have pushed back against this and faulted London regulators and faulted the system overall for pushing back against Uber. Dara takes the complete opposite approach. What he says here is that while the impulse may be to say that this is unfair, one of the lessons I learned over time comes from self-reflection. So it's worth examining how we got here. The truth is that there is a high cost to a bad reputation. We pause for a second and just kind of digest that. What Dar is saying is, let's not put the blame solely on London. So sure, there might be issues with regulation. Sure, we might actually belong in that city, but we've got to pay for some of the bad press we've gotten. We've got to pay for some of the bad reputation that we've developed. And that's a really remarkable change from the highest position of leadership at Uber. At the same time, when he left Expedia, he set the tone. He really set the pace in terms of his approach. And what he says is something you would probably never hear from Travis Kalanick, which is a message of vulnerability as a leader. And he says to his employees at Expedia on his last day, he says, "I have to tell you, I'm scared. I've been here at Expedia for so long that I've forgotten what life is like outside of this place. But the times of greatest learning for me have been when I've been through big changes or taken on new roles. You have to move out of your comfort zone and develop muscles that you did not know that you had." And the message that he's sharing there is not just a message of vulnerability, but really this message of, look, we don't know what lies ahead of us. We don't know what's going to happen, but let's be open to it. And let's take on an approach of being quick and agile to respond to whatever changes and whatever complexities face us so that we can truly develop the muscles.
Shashi, thank you so much for that compelling story. You know, I've been seeing more examples of these sorts of culture and corporate issues in the news industry with Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly, and then recently exposed in the entertainment industry with allegations against Harvey Weinstein. Dozens of actresses have come forward to speak against the harassment that they have experienced in their early careers. And I think it's incredible how one example can have profound effects on national awareness and perhaps have some part in leading to activation and allocation of efforts around similar problems in other settings or industries.
That's a really interesting point, Mihan. I think it strikes at the core of this notion that when data points continue to present themselves, we have to pause and evaluate things objectively and always respond appropriately. We see that when a system is unable to do this, to respond in proper measure to deeply problematic data and evidence at a place like Uber or the Weinstein Company, it causes profound dysfunction on a systemic, organizational-wide level, and sometimes that requires a total system reset, which can be really difficult. And it might seem like a stretch, but truly when we think through these scenarios where those in decision-making positions ignored inconvenient data for years, and in cases that you mentioned, sometimes for decades, they have to reckon with the downstream consequences. And I think it's worth considering for a moment how this might actually manifest in the healthcare setting.
That's so true, Shashi. Let's translate this into the healthcare space for a moment. When clinicians or administrators or managed care stakeholders are exposed to data that may be incredibly challenging to respond to because of various barriers, I think naturally human nature starts with a balanced skepticism, perhaps to defend or rationalize their decisions or our decisions. But it's the ability to evaluate our biases and the data objectively that proves critical in the end. How can they put together the right strategy, the right resources, and the right response to fix their system's issues head on so that it does not eventually require a full system reset like Uber? Fortunately, with the good work that the folks in our industry of CME do day in and day out, HCPs and other stakeholders are not only more frequently activated by objective data points, but they're more prepared and better equipped to allocate the right resources and advance the appropriate solutions.
Yeah, and I think the tough part is oftentimes it doesn't come easy. And I think a lot of folks can appreciate the vulnerability from which the new CEO of Uber comes from, and the fact that he's openly saying, you know, I might not know all the answers and I might not know all the data, but let's work on this together and let's be open to whatever I learn.
Absolutely. From a practical standpoint, oh, we have a question?
So I'll let you continue, but I've got a question after you sort of wrap up your discussion of this case of something that I'm thinking about as you're talking about this.
Just thinking about that vulnerability in CME during this time of change in the healthcare marketplace, we could benefit from allowing vulnerability into learning activities. For example, developing a program that helps a system tackle a specific problem like mitigating their risk or fulfill a challenging requirement such as macro reporting. When doing so, you know, it's okay to say we don't have all the answers. Let's work through this and find the answers together, pooling all of the clinicians, patients, and payers, and folks from perhaps other industries together to come up with a plan.
Yeah, and I love your message there about true collaboration. And I think it's part of the human condition to form collectives in order to correct errors and in order to learn together. And sometimes starting from a place of vulnerability allows for every player to feel empowered and to feel like they're really an integral part of the solution and truly engaged.
Scott, we're ready for your questions.
Yeah, so as you're talking about this, certainly in the news these days, there's been a lot about the opioid crisis, and pharmaceutical companies are certainly kind of having the finger being pointed at them. So any thoughts on how the CME industry can play a role in helping to not necessarily solve the crisis, but kind of bring awareness and perhaps offer assistance in what we do to kind of bring not only bring attention to it, but to kind of help carve out solutions?
Absolutely. What comes to mind is some of the examples that we've seen in CME programs where navigators or folks within the community really dig deep, and they work with patients, they work with doctors, they work with the local community to understand why the crisis is happening from a local, regional level, what types of challenges have led to the point that they're at now, where hundreds of thousands of folks are addicted to opioids, and then working with legislators or working with CME providers or other organizations that are part of the solution to build a strategy that really takes into account the individual patients, the individual communities, and those unique needs that they have.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. I think the message that you're sharing about, again, collaborative learning, collaboratively working with the communities, whether they're HCPs or patients, it's really important. And I think that the challenge about the opioid crisis is, like a lot of other therapeutic areas, for example, or unlike a lot of other places than healthcare, it's tremendously fraught with legislation and regulation from both sides. So I think what's really challenging is anything that happens in this case, I think is going to register loudly on the radar of a lot of folks who are interested in policy of this as well. And I think that speaks to the fact that there has to be true collaboration.
And some of the programs that we've been exposed to have been very successful, and just thinking about those programs as a pilot, they weren't all pilots necessarily, but taking those examples and bringing them into other communities and seeing what the similarities are and what the differences, and how we can expand strategies that have been tested based on data that we've seen, based on outcomes that we've evaluated after an intervention, a strategy has been implemented. Any other questions, Scott?
That's all for now. So do we want to move on to the video?
Yeah, I think it's time to lighten things up a bit. I'd like to introduce our next story about one of my personal heroes and his company, Amazon.com. Scott, would you please play the short video for the audience?
Yeah, so I'm going to transfer over to the video. This is about a 4-minute video, folks. So just bear with me, and hopefully the audio will be loud enough for everyone to hear.
Young Wall Street hotshot named Jeff Bezos was at a crossroads in his career. Continue amassing a small fortune or abandon it all to sell books. That decision would single-handedly change the history of e-commerce, publishing, film, TV, journalism, and quite possibly interstellar travel. That decision also represents a recurring theme in his life. Ever. This is how Jeff Bezos took a simple idea into a garage and built one of the largest marketplaces on the planet. Jeff Bezos was born on January 12, 1964. As a child, he turned his parents' garage into a laboratory for his inventions. In his 1982 valedictorian speech, he discussed colonizing outer space and turning Earth into a giant nature preserve. Graduating from Princeton with a computer science degree, instead of going straight into tech, he had other ideas. Quickly made a name for himself. The youngest ever vice president of Bankers Trust Company. 28, the youngest ever senior vice president of D.E. Shaw & Co. discovered a giant untapped resource, the internet. We've seen the internet grow 2,300% a year. D.E. Shaw did not share his optimism. For the opportunity of a lifetime, Bezos would have to leave Wall Street.
Whatever it is that you want to do, there's going to be risk in your life, and risk is a necessary component of progress.
By September 1995, Amazon processed $20,000 in monthly sales. With its 1997 IPO, Amazon was valued at $400 million. By 1999, Jeff Bezos was worth $10 billion and was Time's Man of the Year. But soon after, the dot-com crash had people skeptical. Was Amazon a sustainable business, or would the bubble burst? Crash eliminating many competitors, Amazon strengthened its grip on the market and expanded beyond books. The Kindle, Alexa, Amazon Studios, and of course,
Amazon Prime. What it does is really lock people into the Amazon ecosystem. They're much more inclined to be buying a lot more, word of mouth spreads. And that has been the biggest driver of Amazon's incredible revenue growth.
Yet historically, Amazon has seen modest annual profits.
An enormous amount of cash flowing through the company, and what Bezos does is he's not returning that to shareholders, he's reinvesting that in the company, for sure in its core businesses, but also going off for these almost moonshot projects.
My vision for Blue Origin is millions of people living and working in space.
This is such a game changer. Amazon to buy Whole Foods.
Jeff Bezos is now the richest person in the world.
$250 million for the storied Washington Post.
His acquisition of the Washington Post not only raised eyebrows, but put him at odds with another well-known billionaire. Few businessmen choose to make an enemy of a president. But having built an empire out of a garage, Jeff Bezos has proven capable of handling any adversary, especially complacency.
Everything we've done and all the success we have is at its root primarily due to the fact that, first, customers are always dissatisfied. Even when they don't know it, even when they think they're happy, they actually do want a better way, and they just don't know yet what that should be. And that's why I always warn people, customer obsession is not just listening to customers. Customer obsession is also inventing on their behalf, because it's not their job to invent for themselves.
To know where, if you already know it's going to work, it's not an experiment. And only through experimentation can you get real invention. The most important inventions come from trial and error with lots of failure. And the failure is critical. And it's also embarrassing. But then as we get older, somehow we get in our grooves, we have a set of expertise and skills. It's kind of a comfort zone. You have to constantly push yourself to say, no, I don't care about failure. In fact, if you're not, I say to Amazon, we have to grow the size of our failures as the size of our company grows. We have to make bigger and bigger failures, because otherwise none of our failures will be needle movers.
Wow. Wow. Great. Great. Yeah. That really struck me. The first is unrelenting.
Welcome to the Personal Capital Dashboard. Link all your accounts for an up-to-date look.
Sorry about that.
No.
Just transitioning from, I wanted the YouTube auto plays the next video, so I think we're all good now. So go ahead.
It went surprisingly well. So yeah, I was saying, I think a couple of the things that stood out about that video on Amazon is Jeff Bezos' unrelenting passion and his desire to continually improve the business. Also his willingness, I think, to take risks, to make mistakes, and to learn from these mistakes in order to evolve. And maybe most significantly, which is really apparent, I think, in the last part of that video, is his customer obsession that really frames Amazon's approach.
Joshua, you nailed it. Bezos refused to settle to do things the way they had always been done before. And actually at the Quality and Innovation Summit in Utah just a few weeks ago, the keynote speaker on healthcare technology raised the question to the audience, who had ordered something from Amazon in the past month? And almost everyone raised their hand. And I think that really speaks to the tremendous impact that the company has reached and how much things have transformed since its beginning. In 1999, he boldly predicted that strip malls would become history, and we're now seeing that evolution happening. Bezos constantly explored and experimented with new industries and types of goods that could be sold online. And at one point, the idea of a Kindle was really strange because people liked the feel and the the smell and everything about the actual books, but you know, they ended up really loving the convenience and environmental factors of the Kindle. And from books to music and videos to clothes and cloud computing, you know, it's just now become the everything store because you can buy anything imaginable there. And with the recent purchase of Whole Foods and perhaps imminent venture into selling pharmaceuticals, it's exciting to imagine how e-commerce will continue to transform.
Yeah, and all of this happened because he was, as you mentioned, activated with data. When he discovered that the internet growth was at 2,300% per year, I think that's the impetus that really started all of this. Jeff Bezos quit his job. He moved across the country to start Amazon in his garage. And I'm sure it could not have been easy to take all of these risks. I mean, let's pause for a second and talk about some of Amazon's failures. And we know a lot about their successes, but they've definitely had their fair share of shortages and shortcomings. And most people never talk about the Amazon Fire Phone, mostly because it lasted less than a year and sunk about $170 million. Or Amazon Register, a payment system that's similar to Square, similar to Apple Pay, or Amazon Web Pay, or Amazon Wallet. I think the list is too long for this segment for us to get into it, but it speaks to this question of vulnerability that we touched on earlier, about not knowing the answers, but being open to taking risks, failing sometimes, making mistakes, and continuing to learn along the way.
I agree, but let's not feel too sorry for those failures, since Jeff's net worth has gone from 18 to $80 billion in the last 2 years. Seeing an example like this where doing things differently and sometimes failing has really paid off, has transformed several industries, and is truly inspiring. And I think the reason why Amazon continues to be successful despite multiple failures is that the innovation and openness to risk has always been rooted in one thing, which is, like you mentioned, the customer obsession. He said in an interview that he would constantly ask his customers for feedback on what they would wanted to buy online, which the answer to is always everything. And he asked for candid feedback about Amazon services. Learnings. And we think about adopting his mentality around customers and applying it to our customers being learners and patients. I think it's a profound notion that we should be constantly innovating for their needs, especially in the context of value-based healthcare and future reimbursement adjustments that they may be facing, or their performance scores being made public in the future. How can we, as developers and supporters of CME, continue to innovate for their challenges?
Absolutely. And just like with e-commerce, we need to continually solicit feedback from our learners and better understand their challenges. And then we have to innovate and try new ways to actually tackle those needs when we understand what they are. Paying attention to consumer data really allowed Amazon to seize on unique opportunities. Even when there are failures such as the Fire Phone or Amazon Web Pay, Bezos was always able to fail forward, meaning he learned from what went wrong and he was able to better meet the market demands in other areas, such as with the Amazon Echo, for example. Not only did Bezos use data on consumer behavior as the basis for Amazon to start the company, but he's also continued to use it as the relentless adaptation for the company's model and developing new offerings to meet consumer needs. For CME, it's going to be critical to stay relevant. There are several trends happening in the healthcare marketplace that all demand a shift in outcomes for a variety of stakeholders.
I agree. For example, we look forward to seeing CMS's final rules for MACRA slated for October 31st, and learning whether CME activities continue to qualify as improvement activities, a key component of Medicare clinicians' composite scores, which will impact their reimbursement. This would continue to be a solid recognition of CME's value to health systems, but regardless, CME has a huge potential role in helping learners and health systems improve their care delivery. MACRA, MIPS, and alternative pay models present a need for health systems, but on the flip side, great opportunities for CME organizations to serve their customers in a way that could have great long-term impact. Well, Shashi, we've talked about how surprising data shaped the Trump campaign to presidency. Continuous learning and vulnerability could help organizations like Uber avoid having to endure major resets, and how Amazon's continuous innovation based on customer needs all relate to the world of CME. Perhaps it's time to take a few questions from our viewers.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Yeah, so I think this was a question that was probably only about half kidding, where someone was saying that they just got a half dozen emails from Amazon recommending other CME conferences that they might like. But that's the sort of thing that Amazon does, is that, you know, and we see it all the time, is whatever you're searching for on the internet, you'll get, you know, pop-ups, you know, pop-up ads that'll kind of relate to that. So I mean, is there any, I mean, do you guys see any CME providers who do something like that, where they will actually utilize the web and social media to try to connect people who are searching for, you know, a certain disease state, connect them with, you know, appropriate education?
Absolutely. We have worked with a number of CME providers that have pop-ups within their parent websites. I'm not sure if I can call them out, but it will ask the viewer or the person who's clicking and finding information on that website whether they are a clinician, whether the information that they're seeking is relevant to an actual patient that they're treating. And sometimes those are ways to bring in new learners into different programs, but also to help a CME provider understand how their information is being utilized, which can go back into the development of CME programs.
Absolutely. And I think to that end, I actually just recently had a conversation with a provider who was sharing along the same lines that this question of validating the audience generation or validating the audience viewership. And a lot of times when we are looking at proposals to support and how they might actually make an impact in the space, one of the questions that we consider is who is the end learner? Who is the end user engager? And the question for us is always ensuring that not only is the program as effective as it can be, but that it reaches the right folks. And so some providers have gone so far as to really customize, as you mentioned, pop-up ads, or making sure, going to extreme lengths to make sure that the eyeballs that receive these advertisements are, for example, actually oncologists, or they're actually neurologists, or they're actually practicing in one part of the country, or that they actually see X number of patients, or that they practice within an academic center, for example, or within a community setting. And I think that the data are out there, and there's so much data, just like Amazon leverages a lot of consumer data, there's so much data available to us as an industry. And being able to really isolate what we're looking for specific to a demographic, I think is going to continue to allow CME to address these challenges head on.
So then here's another question. So beyond supporting education that you feel you know, is going to activate and evolve the healthcare space, are there any other steps that supporters like you guys can take to kind of help you know, prod our industry along in some of these directions?
Yeah, I'll address that maybe from a fairly high level, but I think that what we see from some of the examples that we gave today, the big takeaways are: one, we as an industry need to look at all data and all trends objectively in order to understand how to evolve, and in order to make sure that we're activated with the right data sets. So maybe the role that supporters can play in conjunction with actual folks on the front lines, putting these programs together and actually doing the hard lifting and the hard work to get things going, is to make sure that we're all sort of in sync with the right data, that we all are open to engaging each other in conversations about whether or not, for example, trends like macro are going in certain directions, or whether we need to collaborate and understand whether or not you know, data sets are actually spurious, or if they're actually telling us something that we're not aware of. But to Mihan's point that she discussed earlier, really engaging at a collaborative level, I think, is going to be key. Of course, staying compliant and staying above board, but I think there are a lot of things that we can do. And in fact, we've already seen some traction in this space from not just our organization, but a lot of supporters and a lot of providers as well.
Yes, and just to add to that quickly, I think we, as a supporter, and we've heard other supporters of as well, explore different opportunities, different technologies, and different companies that could be folded into the CME world, and really bring it into different areas, or develop different programs that we haven't seen before, and any different forums that perhaps we haven't thought of before, or we don't traditionally become involved with, perhaps it's time to perhaps put a form together, or really just seek those different forms so that representatives from health systems, representatives from CMS or different policy representatives or data companies. So just bringing in different folks who are experts in their fields and have perspectives to share to CME providers. We're always exploring different opportunities for that.
Absolutely. And I think we as an industry should never reach a point where we receive data that are so troublesome and so challenging that we have to completely pivot and about face and really change the way that we as a system function, with the Uber example. So I think that it's critical for us to always be open, to Amazon's point, to always be accepting new data and objectively evaluating it, but also to work collaboratively. So I think you touched on a lot of those points there.
And always asking our customers, our learners, and perhaps different stakeholders what their needs are, and really driving our business towards those needs.
All right, terrific. Well, I know that I'll be anticipating a call from Jeff Bezos shortly, if looking to acquire CME Palooza. You know, Derek and I always say that the asking price starts at $1 million. So I think he's got a little bit to go around. So for those of you who are watching this session live, or even watching it the recorded version, if you could please take a look at the live tab on our CME Palooza website. We have a quick survey for you, which is where we get a chance to kind of see what sort of data we get from our learners, from the folks who are watching our sessions, this session as well as all of our other sessions. And so with that, I would like to thank Mihan Kelly, and I would like to thank Shashi Cooper, and to just join in the fun.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. And
yes, about
love
time.
it.
About time.
And so for those of you who are going to be sticking with us for our next session, this is our 1 o'clock session, which is our interview with ACCME President Graham McMahon. You will need to refresh your browser here as soon as we end this session, and we will start that next session here in 8 minutes, right at the top of the hour. So thanks again, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you so much. Stay woke, everybody.
Stay woke.